Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang, and I am really looking forward to this podcast because we're going to talk about, well, the way I was about to say it doesn't seem right because I was saying I'm really excited about this podcast because we're going to talk about evil. That doesn't sound quite right. So how about this? I'm looking forward to this podcast because we're going to try to answer a question that is there something inherently brittle and weak about evil? As strong as evil can seem in the world, is there something inherently brittle and weak? And the reason why, and this was a great thought that Curtis had for this podcast, the reason that why this is coming to mind is we've just seen some really dramatic military developments in Ukraine, where we saw a very surprising military offensive from Ukraine in the Kharkiv region in the northern part of the occupied area of Ukraine that has resulted in a surprising collapse of Russian forces. Now, this is not we're not taking from a momentary tactical defeat, even if it turns into a strategic defeat, that it's a stand-in for proof of the brittleness of evil. We've seen good military forces break and run in times past. But what is being revealed during the course of this war in Ukraine is that there is a brittleness, there is a weakness within this Russian authoritarianism. And that one of the reasons why we have seen Ukraine have surprising results in the battlefield is that there is a level of resilience and moral courage that seems present, that seems in many ways, even though Russian troops are facing immense sacrifices and facing immense hardship, that we're not seeing on the part of Russian forces. And it's a launching pad for a conversation. It's not proof of a concept. It's a launching pad for a conversation. And so, Curtis, why is it that you watched these last few weeks and really these last 6 months? And why is it that this question came to your mind?
Well, I've been obsessed with following the Ukraine war ever since it began back in February. Some of this has to do with the fact that, David, like you, I'm a military history buff. And so you're seeing history being made. And I have just been obsessively, almost daily, getting briefings on what I would call the material balance of forces. So I go on websites like the Institute for the Study of War, which is an excellent, daily summary of things like, hey, how is the weaponry of the two sides stacking up? How is the force generation stacking up in terms of the numbers? What are the different geographies and who is favored in the geographical balance and ground lines of communication and all this? So I've been fixated on the material balance of forces and how that is affecting likely outcomes. And I just realized, David, as much as I love military history, I'm a rank amateur when it comes to military stuff. And I actually have much more competence in theological matters. And I realized that in looking at the Ukraine war, I may have been just missing in my overemphasis on looking at the material balance of forces. I've been missing the spiritual balance of forces, and that the spiritual balance of force can also really significantly affect outcomes. And I think this war in particular is a helpful case study in examining the influence of the spiritual balance of forces for at least two reasons. One is because the spiritual contrast is so stark in this war, right? It really is, unlike so many military conflicts, just a very stark case of good versus evil. And I think you'd be very hard pressed to make a case that that's anything but that. So the spiritual contrast is stark. So it's a very sharp good versus evil test case. And then also at the outset, pretty much every military expert, by looking at the material balance of forces, predicted Russian victory, right? That was almost
relatively
unanimous.
Quickly too. Yeah.
And relatively quickly, right? So all that suggests we missed something. We missed a hidden dimension in calculating likely outcomes. And I think that the spiritual balance of force has to at least be one of those missing factors. And here's the thesis, David, that I think I would like for us to explore together, which is that we underestimated the spiritual power of good, and we overestimated the spiritual power of evil. That both of those things took place. And I think it'd be helpful for us to look at both. And maybe we could start by talking about the ways we underestimate the spiritual power of good. And David, I want to ask you, to what extent does the spiritual nature of your cause that you're fighting for actually shape kind of military outcomes and military power, the will to fight, to what extent, since you've been on the front lines, where does that play in? And to what extent does just the material calculation of who's got more weapons and numbers miss that spiritual dimension?
Yeah, it's funny. Again, let me throw out some amateur military history, and then sort of talk from experience. So it is a very well-known phenomenon that generals and military planners for a long time have understood that there is a spiritual dimension to the battlefield. Not spiritual in the sense of, many times have understood a spiritual dimension in the form of religious, like actual religious conflict, but have understood a spiritual dimension in the sort of the spirit of the fighting force, that the spirit, that the proper degree of courage, the proper degree of spirit can overcome a tremendous degree of material and perhaps sometimes even numerical disadvantage. And in fact, sort of the cult of a spiritual force of a fighting force has actually led to some pretty major military blunders. So you can be as courageous as you can possibly be, as many troops were going over the top in World War I, and you're not going to do anything against artillery and machine guns. Right. So there's, I was just finishing reading a book called Ring of Steel about Austria-Hungary and Germany in World War I. And it was really remarkable, the quote, cult of the offensive that took over at that period of history, this idea that the sheer power, the will to win could overcome a tremendous amount of material adversity. And that proved to be a vain hope. So I don't want to overstate it, but what I do think is incredibly important, and what I saw in extreme adversity in Iraq, was that there is something well beyond professionalism that comes to play when you're talking about an effective military. And, at the risk of being cliched, the title of that HBO movie HBO miniseries Band of Brothers is absolutely insightful. This sort of idea that there exists a bond so deep and profound with the person next to you, as different as they might be, as much as they might irritate you on any other day or occasion, but it exists, and it's so real that you would be willing to lay down your life for them. That is at the core of it, a source of intangible strength that is really, truly, profoundly difficult to quantify. And we've seen a lot of this throughout history, that, American military forces maintaining a high degree of professionalism and a high degree of competence in the face of real adversity, even when there's no sort of argument that their homes are at stake. Like if they lose, somebody's going to take their homes, but that kind of degree of professionalism and moral cohesion of the force. And then we've also seen how in the United States military, when that sense of moral cohesion falters or fails, such as at the very end of the Vietnam War, when the force was in real crisis, that we have difficulty sustaining that kind of effort without moral cohesion. And this is something that, when I was constantly defending, why is a JAG officer with a line unit, why is a JAG officer with a combat arms unit? Well, one of the things about the laws of war and the law of armed conflict is it is providing a moral foundation, not just a legal foundation. It's the legal foundation rooted in a moral vision about what it means to fight, for lack of a better term, fight with honor. And that actually a fighting force that fights with honor and has that inherent sort of sense of honor and purpose ultimately is a more effective force. And I could go on with that. And I have a great, well, I'll just tease that I have a tremendous example of that moral force that I can share, but, I'm filibustering. So
No, I want to hear that because it feels like, what you're seeing in some of the evidence from the Ukraine war is that this disparity of moral code that governs the war. So that, on the Ukraine side, at least they're using the categories of violation of the code of conduct of war. They're investigating atrocities, and you see on the Russian side plenty of evidence emerging that these forces, at least some significant part of those forces, are not operating with that same sense of moral honor. And does that, I guess the question is, because it can seem like that, boy, one side is being handicapped because they're bound by moral codes. Another side can act with impunity and commit whatever atrocities they want. And what you're suggesting is actually, when you are bound by some moral code and moral honor, that actually lends, even aside from just the moral rightness of that act, that behavior, it actually lends some real power to your effort. It actually influences even at the military level, the potential outcome. So give me your example, say more, and why that is.
I think a good way of saying it is, if your soul is ripped to shreds, then it is difficult to sustain the will to continue to fight and to lay down your life. In the absence of things like abject fear, like if I don't fight, I'm going to be executed, that kind of.
Right.
But I'll give you a really good example of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a moral core. We had a terrible situation. Well, gosh, almost every day was a terrible situation, but we had a particularly terrible situation occur in where there was a small Al-Qaeda cell that its mode of attack was to use small pickup trucks and a mortar, and it would dash up, lob mortar rounds at American forces into towns, just randomly mortar a village, mortar an American base, mortar an Iraqi base, mortar a village again, and dash off, just sort of trying to indiscriminately create casualties. And we were having a hard time catching these guys. And then at one point we had them. We had them in our sights. We had the truck, and the two occupants of the truck start running away. And right when we were able to open fire, one of the people running picks up a very small child and starts carrying a very small child, almost like a football. And now, under the laws of war, if somebody's using human shields and they're an active enemy combatant, you can open fire if you are aiming not at the human shield, but at the enemy combatant. And if the human shield is killed, the responsibility for the death is with the enemy combatant, because they're the ones violating the law of war.
That's right.
But there wasn't a universe in which our guys were going to open fire in that circumstance, even though there was a legal grounding for it, even though there was a technical legal justification for doing it. And then you could sort of say as a technical legal matter that the fault, if that child was harmed, would be with the terrorist who picked him up. The level of moral injury that would be inflicted upon soldiers if they did that was too much for them to bear. And so it wasn't even really a question. There wasn't a question. It's not like I had to say, well, you could legally, but you might want to rethink, that was not the way this worked. And fortunately, there's a happy ending in the sense that the guy picked up a kid and was running with him on a day that was probably 125 degrees if it was a degree. And so he couldn't keep doing that for very long, and ultimately, dropped the kid, and then we were able to capture him. Didn't even have to kill him. We were able to capture him. But that's a situation where there is this deep and profound moral distinction that arises in an honorable fighting force, and even in the brutality of war. And I think there's a core strength there.
Right. Because just speaking almost very concretely, suppose that soldier, I guess what you're saying is, suppose that soldier does open fire.
Right.
the force might win a temporary, momentary victory of sorts in killing that soldier, but you've taken out not only that American soldier, but that whole unit probably is now traumatized and rendered less combat effective, even just at a pure sort of material calculation of the outcome of that moral injury, right?
Well, there's huge cost borne. I mean, I could tell stories about this for a long time, but there were situations in which, thankfully, very few, but there was one terrible situation in which a soldier opened fire on a truck that matched the description of a truck that was a potential VBED, vehicle-borne IED, that had blown through a checkpoint, that had passed, blown through warning flares, and seemed to be heading straight towards one of our combat outposts. Fired, shot, killed the driver. The driver was not Al-Qaeda. He was a farmer and father who was listening to music really loudly and super oblivious to everything going on and missed all of the warnings. And that soldier was devastated. I mean, devastated. Even though he did not do anything wrong under the rules of engagement, under the laws of war, and he had no real choice if there is a vehicle matching the description of an IED, vehicle-borne IED, charging through checkpoints and warnings and all of the escalation of force. It was devastating. It was devastating. And so one of the things you want to do is, especially in warfare like that, where there's a mixture between civilians and combatants, is you really want to mitigate and minimize the potential for that profound moral injury. Because that
And David,
moral injury... Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you though, but then I guess some listeners might be listening and say, but does that moral, and I don't know if there's a way you can answer this question, but does that moral injury happen to people fighting on the side of evil? Right. So when a Russian unit commits a atrocity, execution of civilians in a Ukrainian village, do we think, and I know it's impossible to get into the mind of evil, right? But do we think in some way that actually renders evil and that Russian force somehow less effective, less potent, militarily speaking?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, because there's sort of the stereotype of something that's truly evil, a force that's truly evil, is just going to be full of stone cold killers, right?
Right.
But, we have a lot of literature, even from the darkest and deepest, blackest evil of, the modern era, sort of the Hitler's Wehrmacht, in World War II, that there were moral injuries that were inflicted on German soldiers even during that. That's not to say that there weren't a cohort of stone cold killers, that there weren't people who are sort of like what you would call apex level evil. But there is a long record of anguish, fear. A lot of atrocities are committed out of fear, not just sort of the fear of the enemy that you're committing atrocities against, but fear inflicted by your senior leadership. You must do X, Y, and Z, or you will die, or you will be punished. So there's an enormous amount of atrocities that are inflicted in part through fear. And, look, you don't want to exaggerate it. The German army in World War II was extraordinarily formidable. Extraordinarily. Nobody would say that it wasn't. But there's this really interesting book by, I believe it's Richard Overy, called Why the Allies Won. And this is a book, we often look at history as, why the Allies won by Richard Overy. And we can put that in the show notes. And there's this interesting question that says, we look at history as if, it was all inevitable, like the Allies were going to win. It was only a matter of time, U.S. industrial might, et cetera, et cetera. And he says something interesting, in that in 1943, if you're looking at the raw industrial base of the Axis powers and the raw industrial base of the Allied powers and the manpower of their respective forces, the Axis were right there. I mean, the raw parts of Europe that Hitler had conquered, the Japanese had possessed large chunks of Chinese territory. They had swept aside Allied forces in much of the Pacific. The Axis empires were vast and powerful, and yet they couldn't ultimately match either the manpower or the capacity of free peoples.
Yeah.
And it's one of the more interesting comparisons of what is the difference between a free people and a, in many cases, enslaved or oppressed people in this sort of ultimate contest.
Well, and I think what you're getting at again is this point of that there is more to certainly war, but also just more to any human endeavor than just the material balance of forces in place. And, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about the Ukraine war, and just what's often cited as a huge, unexpected sort of game-changing material injection was like the anti-tank missiles that the West shipped to the Ukraine. And that was certainly true. But when you actually as I did, sort of do this sort of deep YouTube video dive to understand, wait, what does it actually take to fire one of these missiles in combat? You realize it took an enormous amount of courage. Like you have to expose yourself in the open, get up really close, and really be willing to die and, for your cause. And so you have this material weaponry that actually requires a spiritual component to it, which is this courage and a willingness to actually, lay down your life possibly in the defense of your country and your side and your comrades and so forth. And so you just can't separate out, the material from the spiritual in this way. And it's clear that the Ukrainian spirit, their sense that they were defending something right, important, valuable in terms of their country, their communities, their loved ones, has played a huge difference. And that was underestimated. We underestimated the power of that. Yeah.
Misjudging that spirit is probably the heart of Putin's miscalculation at the start of the war. But one thing that I want to talk about in addition to what is the power of good, I just had this thought and I wrote it down about why does evil often appear more powerful than it is?
Right.
And so I have a thought that I've written down, but I want to hear your answer to the question, Curtis. Why is evil more often less powerful than it appears? Okay,
I've thought a lot about this. And this is where, if listeners, if you've made it thus far, I want you to stay with us, because if there's any listener out there who's like, they're talking about military history. I do not care about military history. I don't care about war. Hang with us, because I want to invite you to think about what we're talking about about the nature of evil in the context of the Ukraine war. It's a parable. It's a lesson for the nature of evil, I think, in all realms of our life: politics, culture, in our own organizations, even in our own relationships. That we are very prone to overestimating the power of evil. And I would argue that evil can seem powerful because, and let me throw out three common qualities of evil that make it seem powerful. Okay. So one is that it lies, it denies truth. And there can be a seemingly power in the ability to just lie indiscriminately. Okay. The second is that it violates boundaries. It is not constrained by boundaries. It is by its very nature willing, even eager to violate proper boundaries. So it lies, it violates boundaries. And the third is it relies on fear. Okay. It relies on fear as a motivating factor. And all three of these qualities, that it's falsehood based, right? That it violates boundaries and that it relies on fear, it can make it seem like evil is powerful in that regard, right? Because you're not bound by, and good is hamstrung, right? You're not bound by truth. You're not bound by boundaries, and you can evoke fear, which can actually be in the short term a very motivating, force. And it's true that in the short term, I would argue that those qualities give evil a certain power that good seemingly lacks. But here's the thesis, David, that in the long run, those qualities end up becoming self-defeating. That in the long run, they contain within themselves the seeds of their own defeat. There's a brittleness to that. Yeah. And let's just take as example the first one, the fact that evil is just willing to lie and to deny truth. Well, David, how well can let's go back to the military context. How well can a military force function if it is predicated on on falsehood, if it is not a truth-seeking institution, if it is not actually committed to acting on the basis of truth, I would argue that it gets into trouble because
Yeah.
war punishes falsehood. War punishes mistakes. If you're not acting and confronting and willing to embrace even hard truths like we're outnumbered, like we don't actually have as much, we're not as strong as we think we are, that war will punish you. And that when you run against the grain of truth, the grain of reality, eventually you'll get a splinter.
Yeah. I put it, as you wrote down, evil lies. I was writing down a sort of an inherent weakness attached to that, and that is evil degrades trust. So the lie over a short period of time, for example, can have some tangible real world benefits to it. I mean, there's a reason why lying is alluring, right? It has tangible in the near term, you perceive it as having benefits, but it also has the profound long-term weakness of degrading trust. And we're putting this at this extreme level of war. That's an extreme sort of test of integrity. But we know this from our own lives. People lie all the time to escape an immediate consequence. No, Mom, I wasn't drinking. You know, and yet, as soon as Mom finds out that you were, there is this profound degradation of trust that exists. And so, everything that is in the short term strength becomes over the long term a weakness.
So let's just even bring that insight back in the domestic political situation for a moment. At this point, given Trump's record as just as a businessman, and what's coming out in all of these investigations, who is actually going to trust him and enter a contract with him? Like, only the most desperate, incompetent business person at this point is going to think Trump is actually true to his word in any business dealing or in his representation of his financial realities. And I've got to believe at some point that is going to degrade his ability to get things done. Everybody has. He has to surround himself with only the kinds of people who kind of are that desperate and can act with that and have that poor of a judgment. And so there's just ways in which when you deny truth, you degrade your own ability to be effective, right?
Yeah. You know, one of the thing that I put down is that we shouldn't mistake the fact that evil is alluring for the reality or for an idea that evil is ultimately powerful.
That's right.
Now, allure has its own power, of course, but one of the things that is consistently a reality, whether you're talking about the short-term benefits, say, of lying and deception, from geopolitics to personal relationships. But, you know, hang with me for a minute. Many years ago, Nancy and I were driving in rural Tennessee, and in the pre-online porn era, where, you know, online porn was dominant, you had a lot more of these little adult shops like all over the place, and a lot of them were awful, like, you know, run down, gross places. And you know, we were driving by one once, and this guy kind of furtively looks around and walks in. And there was something just so pathetic about the scene. You know, this guy doesn't want anyone to see him, but he can't help himself. He's going into this porn shop. And it just struck me, and it struck us, that that's not what he envisioned for his life. Like that is not, you know, I can't wait till I'm old enough to like not be afraid to show myself in public outside of a porn shop. That's not a thing, you know. But what happens is evil is alluring for a while. The whatever high from pornography is alluring, but often is ultimately what ultimately ends up happening is it's immiserating. It's alluring, but ultimately immiserating. And that's in the small and the micro sense. It's also true in the macro sense that evil is immiserating in a macro sense as well. And you know, that's, I think, understanding that distinction between alluring. That's why people are so prone to fall, that it's alluring. It offers the short-term benefit, but losing sight of the fact that it's ultimately immiserating It's that inability to take that long view that makes us devalue the power of virtue and elevate the power of vice.
David, I want to talk about the second quality. So we talked about that, how evil is actually more brittle than it can seem because it denies truth and therefore also erodes trust, right?
Mm-hmm.
And can't get things done because it's running against the grain of reality. But I also want to talk about the second thing that I talked about, which is that evil in its very nature, one of its qualities that make it seem strong is its willingness to violate proper boundaries. So obviously Russia very physically was quite willing to violate long-standing national boundaries. And we can think of boundaries, and this is why we can think of the good as weak, because we think of, well, if you adhere to boundaries, you're adhering to like constraints, you're adhering
Mm-hmm.
to barriers to the will, your will to power, right? But I think in the sort of theological biblical sense, boundaries are not impediments to the good. Boundaries are not obstacles to the good. Boundaries are guardrails. Boundaries are actually what actually help you find your way through the world and say, oh, don't go over there. If you go over there, you're going to slip and fall across the side of the mountain, right? And so that's why boundaries are actually a good thing to respect. And we see that, to go back to the Ukraine war, that Russia's willingness to just completely trample over long-standing boundaries that have been established has actually caused it to overreach and cause it to just have dramatic failures, strategically speaking, right? If you started
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning of before the war began, you thought, okay, Putin, what are your strategic aims here? He's like, well, I want to break the West. I want to break the West resolve. Well, what it turns out is by his willingness to trample over these boundaries, he's united the West, such that Sweden and Finland, which are, key parts of his geographic vulnerability, now are willing to join NATO. This is like a
Mm-hmm.
huge strategic defeat for Putin. And it's an example of which by violating boundaries, you tend to slip and slide, you overreach and stumble. And so there's a built-in tendency of evil. It's a tendency of evil to eventually to overreach and stumble because it is so willing to ignore the natural boundaries that are erected in the world and ultimately, I believe, by our creator to signal, no, don't go over there. You're going to go off the side of the mountain if you cross over that boundary.
Yeah, that's I wrote down the second thing. So with evil lies, what's the effect that degrades trust? When you violate boundaries, what's another effect there? It displays arrogance.
Mm,
So essentially what you're saying, perhaps rules for thee, not for me. And there's that old
right,
sort of conservative shibboleth or conservative saying about Chesterton's fence. Like if you
right.
see a fence, it's not to say that every fence is virtuous and every fence exists for a reason, but we got to know why it's there before we just
Yeah,
sort of plow on over it. But that sense of violating boundaries appeals to our own arrogance. It appeals
right.
to our alleged ability to discern what is right in our own eyes, but feeds also that sense of arrogance, which will be inevitably exposed sooner or later, maybe
Yeah.
not right away, but inevitably exposed as we display that arrogance and walk over that fence.
And then let's talk about the third one, which is this fear base, that there's this way in which evil relies on fear to get its way. And there's something intrinsic to that about evil, and there can inject a short-term power in that because people cower and are afraid in that way. But David, what's the vulnerability of evil there? What's the vulnerability of long-term reliance on fear as your motivating force?
Yeah, that's another great question. And what I'm thinking, if we're thinking about geopolitics, for example, is you had a fear-based regime that existed behind the Iron Curtain. It was a fundamentally fear-based. Neighbor could turn on neighbor. You utter the wrong thing, you could find yourself facing, a show trial. It was a fear-based regime. And what was the effect? Is they had to build walls to keep people in. And ultimately, people, as much as fear is wielded as an instrument of discipline, it also causes people to want to flee
Yeah.
a fear-based regime. It creates an intolerable situation ultimately for human beings who do not want to live in that atmosphere. And one of the most powerful scriptures that George Washington referenced almost 50 times in his writings is Micah 4:4. Every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid. And that's a beautiful vision of sort of a peaceful and just society. You have your own place, and critically, you have a sense of security. And without that sense of place and without that sense of security, what are you going to want to do? You're going to want to go find that. You'll go through extreme adversity to go find that. And that's what's so inherently unstable about a fear-based regime.
And it is not the most powerful force in the world, right? And we know that from reality, but also from truth. We know that from military history. David, I think you told me that you had a conversation with the author Stephen Pressfield at some point recently. He's the author of numerous sort of military fiction, historical fiction, if you will. One of my favorite books that he wrote was called Gates of Fire, and it's a book about the battle at Thermopylae. And there's just a moving scene in there where one of the characters, a mentor figure, is speaking to a younger figure, and they're musing on how do you motivate men to enter the fray of battle with all of its awful violence and suffering and death and so forth, that man naturally is going to fear that. And they were sort of the philosophical moment. And the mentor figure sort of has this moment. He says, like, what is the he was asking, what is the opposite of fear? And he said, the opposite of fear is not a greater fear. The opposite of fear is love. And that whole book is talking about the love that exists among the comrades that enables them to overcome fear. And that's an image of the greater theological truth that in God, there is no fear. That is, as 1 John 4:18 says, there's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Right? There's no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. That love actually has the power to overcome fear. And I think what I'd argue the Ukraine war is a parable of that. It's a parable of that it is possible for love of country, love of each other, love of the good, to drive out fear and literally drive out fear-based power, quite literally. And that is a truth that is not just restricted to the battlefield, but I want to say is true because it's ultimately rooted in God, in the very nature of God, who is perfect love, who drives out fear, as 1 John says, that we ought to really embrace in all aspects of our lives. That where we find that fear governs, whether it's the fear of a boss and what he might do to us if we say the right thing or stand up for the right thing, or a bully at school, that if we can tap into love, what and who is it that we love, that we are truly trying to defend here, that we can tap into a greater power that drives out that fear.
Can I make a digression here then to a subject that I think is really front of mind for an awful lot of people these days? And when you talked about what's the opposite of fear is love, I'm digressing to a conversation I just had yesterday about masculinity and the crisis of masculinity. And one of the interesting aspects of the crisis of masculinity is a lot of people are locating that in sort of denigration of certain kinds of quote unquote masculine virtues, such as physical courage or physical strength or things like this. And I do think that there is something real to, if you tell a young man that something about their quest for physical courage is inherently toxic, you are harming them in some important ways. You should be shaping someone's character if they're someone who is physically courageous, not denigrating that side of them. But when you look at the crisis of masculinity in this country, what I increasingly see is a crisis of love, a lack of love. So let's look at some categories, and we're just going far. We're on a tangent here, Curtis. I'm just going to warn you.
Okay, tangent alert.
tangent alert. Let's look at some categories. Both boys and girls are impacted by fatherlessness.
Yeah.
Who does the social sciences says impacted more? Boys are more impacted by fatherlessness. Deaths of despair hit both men and women. Definitely. Who is hit far worse by deaths of despair? Is it men or women? It's specifically single men. Unmarried or divorced men are hit by deaths of despair at a rate that dwarfs every other demographic. Friendlessness is accelerating in the United States. Where is it accelerating the most? With men. Okay, so my each one of these three things, whether it's fatherhood, whether it's being a husband, where it's being a spouse, or whether it's being a friend, all of those are profound relationships rooted in love.
That's right.
And the absence of those relationships, I think far more so than, well, they don't let you play in recess as hard as you used to play, is responsible for the degradation and for the crisis that we're seeing in young men. End of tangent.
No, that's absolutely right. Because when you do not have the love of a father, of a friend, of a stable family, that creates insecurity. That creates a deep existential fear. And so you don't have that love that drives out that fear that wells us as human beings. And that takes us into all sorts of very weak and dark places. Let me just also, while we're on the tangent, I apologize for the sound of the drilling that's going on. A work crew has chosen at this precise moment to begin a project right outside my house. So I apologize for that. Let's bring this back to this whole issue of that evil is weaker than we think. Evil is more brittle than we think. I think this is why it's helpful to articulate all these ways in which evil, in the ways that it denies truth, that it violates boundaries, that it relies on fear, that all that evil is weaker than it thinks, I think is important for us, not just in understanding military outcomes, but I think in all realms, including our domestic cultural situation. Because I think there's a way when we talk, David, we've talked about the exhausted majority in the past. And I think one of the factors in our exhausted majority is thinking, just evil is going to win its day. You just it's not, you can't stand up to it. It's hopeless. It's worthless. And I would argue that one of the important implications of this recognition that evil is weaker than we think it is, that evil is weaker than it seems, is more brittle, more likely to crack at some point, is that it ought to embolden us, those of us who want to be on the side of good and want to stand against evil, is to not overestimate evil, is to actually kind of strengthen our resolve to stand, because evil may be closer, that evil force that we are wanting to battle against, evil may be closer to collapse than it seems. Like, we just never know when evil is at that point of overreach, when it's at that point of that it gets so brittle that it will crack. We can't know. We can't know when we're going to reach that point. So this is not a promise that if you just stand up to evil, it will automatically fall in every case. You may get run over. But the point is, you just don't know. You do not know. And that if you grant it more power, it's like you're granting power to a shadow. And what we need to do is actually shed light. And turns out that evil force is a lot smaller, that it casts a bigger shadow. It's like the mouse that seems like a lion in the wrong light, right? And so we need to be willing to stand. We need to be willing to cast light. Maybe willing to suffer a current immediate defeat. But even in doing that, in our willingness to stand up to evil and suffer defeat, we're in some ways part of that process of exposing evil more, because we're forcing it to become even more brittle and even more rely on all of these qualities that actually make it more vulnerable in the long run.
Well, speaking of Pressfield, again, Sarah and I had him on the podcast, on the flagship podcast, and he was really interesting because he wrote this book called Man at Arms. And Man at Arms is a historical fiction account of a former Roman soldier guarding Paul's letter to the Corinthians as it is being transported to its destination. And his thesis was, again, it's historical fiction. This is all fiction, was that It was being pursued because people rightly saw Paul's letter to the Corinthians as a grave threat to the Roman Empire. I thought that was fascinating. And I asked him, why? Why would you write it? Why would you write something that posited Paul's letter to the Corinthians as a threat to this, Mediterranean, European spanning, most powerful military force in the world at that time? And here you've got a letter to a small, struggling, persecuted church. Why is that a threat? And, his answer was really interesting. And I think folks would enjoy listening to it. But essentially, at the risk of excessively paraphrasing, it was communicating transcendent truth beyond the reach of Caesar. And as strong as Caesar was, the transcendent truth was beyond Caesar's reach. And, that's, of course, the truth of the cross. Caesar's representatives did all they could possibly do to a human being to end the threat of that human being.
That's right. Yeah.
And yet Caesar is gone and Christ is alive. And that is, that is when we're talking about the ultimate brittleness and weakness and fragility of evil is fully encapsulated, ultimately encapsulated in the words, where, O death, is your victory, where, O grave, is your sting. That expression of evil is ultimately brittle.
By the way, I don't know Pressfield's theological or biblical chops, but you really can't understand the New Testament and the New Testament letters of Paul if you don't understand imperial language. That basically Paul wrote very deliberately. Well, all of Paul's letters are deliberately kind of subtle, sometimes not so subtle, digs at imperial language. So even the word "the gospel," that's a language that, and announcing the gospel, that's an imperial language. The gospel of peace was what Caesar said he was announcing in the world, because he ended civil strife and war through military victory, or Christ. When we've come to so take Christ as almost like, is that Jesus' last name? Like, no, Christ is simply the term for Messiah or King. It's an imperial language. And so when you say Jesus is the Christ, is the King, it's a subversive proclamation. And I could go on, and we'll put in the show notes some just great books that sort of outline just the anti-imperialistic sort of subversive message of Paul's letters, just by announcing that Jesus was the Lord of all, that how thoroughly subversive and threatening that is to a regime that has proclaiming Caesar is the Lord of all, is the King of all, is the Christ. And so you really can't understand the Gospels without that. And that is a great example of where it's thrown. The Roman Empire's greatest weapon was death, was its ability to inflict death. And the cross was the symbol of that. The cross was how the Roman Empire said, look, if you stand against our empire, this is your destiny. We will put you on a cross. The cross was reserved for political opponents, right? And so this message that there was this rebel who was crucified, and only rebels are crucified in the Roman Empire. It's not a criminal punishment. It's a political punishment. That somebody has defeated the cross. That's a very potent message. That's like somebody has defeated the M1 battle tank. There's a force greater than the force that the Roman Empire is saying is the ultimate expression of our power. And so the fact that this movement now has tapped into that power, which ultimately is love, which ultimately is the power of God's love that raised the Son from death, from the cross, that is actually a very threatening message to a regime that relies on fear and power.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting when you raise it like this. It puts in a new light the 1 Timothy verse, God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power. Now, critically, it's, this is written to a tiny church besieged by the Roman Empire. It's not talking about, mobilize your constituency and vote out Caesar
right.
power.
Get out the vote.
Yeah, it is power. It's the power of God, power, love, and of sound mind. And that's the contrast to the spirit of fear. And the first one is this sense of actual power.
Yeah.
The true power. And that is what is so daunting to us, is that we often can't see it.
That's right.
And it takes us, sometimes we can only see it in glimpses. And that's the power of that passage that you read from Lord of the Rings and Return of the King, that fleeting glimpse in the heart of Mordor. And that'll remind you that the shadow is fleeting, which is so, so powerful. And by the way, I'd forgotten this. Karen Swallow Prior doesn't actually like Lord of the Rings.
Ugh.
So we didn't have that fight. We need to have that fight. But it is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I give you a free day. Are you going to read Lord of the Rings or are you going to read Jane Austen? I think the answer is quite obvious for who wins on that contest.
Obvious, yes. Yeah. But that contrast between the spirit of fear is what you experience in the face of evil. Immediately, the very next thing here is power. There's power. There is power that you can rely on, and that is available, that should crush that spirit of fear, no matter how strong the forces of evil appear in the moment.
And again, I want to emphasize that this calculation of the balance of power, it takes place in every level of our life. This is not just at the global level of military conflict. It's not just at the domestic level of national politics. It gets at every level of our life, where we are prone to underestimate the power of good, overestimate the power of evil, and therefore make choices that ultimately don't reflect reality and end up shortchanging our own God-given, God-mandated power to stand for his good and against the evil that opposes him. And again, I want to underline, this is not a promise of immediate success. I am not saying that, look, you stand against the evil boss or the evil abuser in your life, you will be guaranteed victory. That's not what we're saying here. But we're saying in the long run, you are participating in, what Martin Luther King Jr. would call the moral arc of the universe. The moral arc of the universe bends towards justice because it bends towards God, because God is just and God is the architect and creator of the universe, that the world is created in a way that ultimately will defeat evil, because God is ultimately the power at work defeating evil. And so we're on the winning side. Ultimately, in the long run. And we've just got to develop that mindset that's willing to stand firm in the short term and willing even to suffer defeats in the short term, because in the long run, evil is doomed.
Speaking of evil, producer Chris put in, there might be a gender breakdown in Lord of the Rings affection. Chris, I'm not going to be a misogynist and presume that women dislike Lord of the Rings.
Oh my God. My wife makes every year an annual pilgrimage to Middle Earth. So we reject that stereotype.
We reject that misogyny, Chris Carter. We reject that. So, but anyway, another digression. He's saying that's not what I said.
But David, since a lot of our listeners, though, are interested in national politics, I do want to actually press home this point, because it strikes me that so much of the current political climate is dominated by this overinflation of Trump's power, right? That in the GOP, for instance, we've got one of our major parties that essentially is captive to the fear of Donald Trump's power, that they are unwilling to stand up to him in any way, and are just willing to go along with all of his lies, all of his violation of his boundaries, and all of a lot of fear, right? All the qualities of evil we've just described. How could this? Do you see a scenario where that evil, and I'm calling it evil, I'm not saying it's like the worst evil of all kind, but there is an evil to this. Do you see a scenario where we see signs of that cracking? We see signs of this brittleness that may provide some hope for our domestic political context.
Yeah, that's a really good question. What I would say is that there is a con in progress that still has a hold even though there is sufficient evidence that the con, sufficient evidence to expose the con. And so here is the con. And the con is this, that fundamentally, as much as you may dislike Trump, as much as you may have real problems with Trump, he's not the person that you would have absolutely selected to lead the Republican Party, although there are a lot of people who are like, Trump all the way, that he's a necessary evil. So that is the con, that essentially says, if you want to accomplish what you want to accomplish for the sake of public policy, for the sake of policies that you believe will lead to human flourishing, he is a necessary evil. And alternative attempts with higher integrity have regrettably failed, and therefore we have to turn to this. And what I would say to that is, number one, if you're a Christian believer, you're looking at things through the wrong lens, where you're saying that if the necessity is political triumph, if that's the necessity, then you're looking at the ministry of Jesus and the ministry of Paul and the ministry of Peter as just failures, which can't be right, right? So that can't be your measure of whether or not for example, Christianity is able to flourish, is whether or not it achieves political power. So let's put that aside. The brittleness, the weakness of the Trump movement has already been exposed. I tweeted this out recently for all of those who say, well, this is the necessary evil. You're just wrong. Here's a statistic that comes from my friend Jim Garrity from National Review. On Trump's watch, Republicans lost control of the House, the Senate, the White House, have fewer elected governors, and lost 245 state legislative seats around the country. So what's necessary about that? Even if you're sitting there thinking, well, power is the goal. And so in many ways, the brittleness has already been exposed for those who have eyes to see. This whole con that there is a necessary evil, the necessity of it, the alleged necessity of it, has already been debunked. But what fear does is, if I were to share those statistics with some folks, a lot of them would be in disbelief. No, Trump is the only way to win. This is sadly, I hate it, David, wish it wasn't the case, but this is the way that we have to win. And I think that is, one of the ways that fear maintains a hold, that the combination of lies and fear maintain a hold, is you come not to understand reality, and then you become afraid to explore what the reality is.
That's right. You're not unwilling to turn on the light in the room that exposes the mouse as being the mouse, not the lion, right? The one,
right?
And dispel the shadow. And that's where I guess I don't know, David. I've been wanting to feel like our message, in this work that we want to do in the Post-Partisan Christian Project, really should almost be like stand apart from the fray and really cast the light on things. And I think there's a real truth to that. But I'm also increasingly thinking that part of what we need to do is also actually be in the fray in terms of stating the truth and in terms of exposing kind of the shadow that evil is casting, because that's necessary. Somebody's got to stand up and just like, no, this is not true. This is not real. This is, and it's in that same way that's why I take the Ukraine war as a parable, is because what Ukraine did was like, no, we're not buying the material calculation that all the experts say is what is the inevitable outcome of this material balance of forces. We're going to stand up and we're going to punch back. And I don't mean punch back in when I use to that in the domestic sense. I'm not talking about, violence, certainly not violence or partisan violence, but just say, no, we're not going to go along with this. We're going to resist. And in that resistance, you are forcing evil to reveal even more of its brittleness. So we've talked Lord of the Rings. Let's go to Harry Potter.
So Harry Potter was the boy who lived, right? The boy that Voldemort did not kill. And I'm not a Harry Potterologist, but what we need are people who are willing to take on the current environment and to take on the fear-based discourse and not take it on by, as you said, punching back twice as hard, but being willing to absorb the slings and arrows.
That's right.
Being willing to absorb the attacks and saying, and yet I'm still here.
That's right.
And yet I'm still speaking. And that's not just in the national political level for, people who are willing to endure Twitter draggings or threats or whatever it is. It's also very much at the personal level. How much are you willing to sort of say, I'm not going to run around picking fights with Uncle Jim or Aunt Betty or whatever, but I'm not going to be intimidated out of speaking the truth by people who are bullies, by people who are attempting to be intimidating. And this is something that's a real issue for a lot of people, whether you have a public platform like a podcast or, a column or whatever, or a position of public leadership. It's just an increasing issue for an awful lot of just regular folks that they have to be willing to take an arrow or two or 10 to simply say what's true. And that requires overcoming a degree of fear, even if it's not, say, physical fear, but a fear of social ostracization or a fear of exclusion or a fear of a disrupted relationship. Again, you never abandon the fruit of the Spirit when you are speaking the truth, but there's still that necessity of truth.
Well, David, we've covered a lot of ground going from Ukraine to Middle Earth to Harry Potter. What is left to cover? I think we've
I mean, House of the Dragon, but no, we don't need to cover that. It's a disturbing show. Let me just say, House of the Dragon.
It is a disturbing show. Yeah.
I prefer Rings of Power. I prefer Rings of Power. So.
All right. We've got that as our viewer recommendation to steer folks in that direction. David, any other announcements, things that we want to talk about, promote, plug?
No announcements other than our normal plug. Please rate us. Please subscribe. If you already listen, just go ahead and subscribe to us. That helps us out to boost those subscriber numbers. Also, in addition to absolutely checking out redeemingbabel.org, we've had some big additions to the Dispatch. We've had Kevin Williamson join us. We had Nick Catagio, who goes by the pseudonym, I was going to say nom de something, nom de plume. Of Alla Pundit, longtime writer, anonymously, has joined us, and he's awesome. His early stuff for us has been awesome. So please check out thedispatch.com, and we'll be back next weekend.